What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my DLC review for Cyberpunk 2077's Phantom Liberty DLC after having played through it for myself the first time. Though I do want to mention I'm going to focus specifically on the DLC here. If you're looking for a video about Update 2.0 and how it changed some of the game, I've already made a video on that previously. And here in a couple of days, probably Friday, I should have a full re-review of the entire game, taking both the new patch and the DLC together and talking about how the entire game plays now. But today we're talking about Phantom Liberty, which is the first and ultimately going to be the only DLC that Cyberpunk gets, though it looks like despite the game's rough launch, it's going to go out on a high note, as Phantom Liberty wound up being very good. So I wanted to dive into it and talk about some individual pieces. Starting, of course, with the story setup, Phantom Liberty takes place alongside the main campaign of the game. In order to start it, you have to reach a point in the story where you've dealt with Placide and the Voodoo Boys in Pacifica, at which point the DLC will open up by simply sending you a message to start it. That's a decent way into the game though, so if you'd like to jump straight to the DLC, you can do that by simply starting a new game and selecting the Phantom Liberty option, which will set you up with a sort of default character that you'll then have to customize and adjust. This is very similar to how they handled the Witcher 3's DLC, as a side note, so no real surprises there. But from here, I want to talk a little bit about the story, obviously. However, I'm not going to spoil it, or at least I'm going to keep it as minimal as possible. So I'm mostly going to be talking about the setup and some general stuff and my thoughts on it. Once we're ready to start, however, we will be contacted by someone claiming they can help V with the problem of the chip in their head slowly killing them, which is of course the main plot hook for the game. And with this promise of an alternative solution, we meet up with Songbird, a netrunner for the new United States. And while there's not really enough time in this video to give the context of the new United States its due, I would recommend, if you want to learn more about that, search up the wikis and everything for Cyberpunk lore, as it is an interesting read. But in any case, Songbird is contacting us because due to a hack on the Space Force One, basically the president's mode of travel, they're going to be forced to land in Night City, and she would like you to help them avoid crash landing in Dogtown, a section of Night City added with the DLC that is largely self-governed by a paramilitary organization known as the Barguests, led by one Kurt Hansen, who has ties with the new United States before ultimately being abandoned there. But instead of just giving up and going home, so to speak, he and his men effectively just took control of an area of the city known as Dogtown, which they tightly control. And the DLC itself kicks off with the president crash landing in the vicinity of Dogtown and us trying to save it. But from there, it spirals into a spy thriller, as the advertising for the game told us, where we have to deal with a bunch of political machinations in exchange for the possibility of a cure for V's condition, which will ultimately kill him if nothing is done about it. Which again kind of makes up the crux of the main plot of the game. So in many ways you could view the plot of this DLC as a side path exploring an option for a potential cure for us. Now, that's as much as I want to say directly, but I do want to mention a few general notes about the story. Ultimately, I would say there are a few paths through the DLC, as it handles choice and consequence, I would say, much better than the main narrative does, and you can make several choices throughout that will determine your way through. In fact, at one point you can just outright refuse to participate, which obviously kind of cuts out most of the content here, but is a valid option. Now, discounting that, there are 4 endings to the DLC in particular based on your choices, and then of those endings, a couple of them can lead to an alternative ending for the main game as well. So I mention that to highlight the fact that this DLC does a really good job with choice and consequence, at least for the main quest, which is something that most of the game kind of lacked outside of a few things here and there, such as with Takamura or with Johnny himself. So already off to a pretty good start. However, in addition to that, while the beginning of the DLC is a bit railroady, honestly, there's a sort of intro sequence you need to get through before you can freely move in and out of Dogtown, and it sets up the rest of the DLC. So while that part is a little on rails, it does branch out from there and it gets a lot better. And as this is a spy thriller, we will eventually meet up with all sorts of players who have a stake in this particular political conflict, one of which is of course played by Idris Elba, which was all over the marketing, as you know. And with it being Being a spy thriller, a lot of the story revolves around deciding who to trust, who not to trust, and that leads to all sorts of choices, and it was very well done. You never fully know who's doing what, who you can put your trust in, what their actual plans are, what their motivations are, and it has a lot of really solid moments. So I can honestly say that I enjoyed the story of Phantom Liberty very much, and in many ways I would say it is better than most of what the base game has to offer. There are a few things I like more from the main game, so I wouldn't say it's a completely better experience, but it is more or less a more interesting experience. If you're just going to rush the main story, you're looking at probably like 10-ish hours, though the total content for the DLC is going to run you like 20 to 25, give or take. But that's just the story, so let's talk about the rest of this DLC. For starters, we have the area of Dogtown to explore. A new neighborhood in Night City, and surprisingly, they managed to make this one feel very unique. In some ways, it's a lot like Pacifica in the sense that the NCPD don't really come there, and it is largely governed by its own forces. That means when police respond to an event, it is actually the Barghest soldiers doing it, and everything's kind of self-run by this militia. However, as you can probably see from the footage, that doesn't necessarily mean things are going well, as everything in here is very dilapidated and falling apart, which sees two extremes of people living in incredible poverty juxtaposed against the other parts of Dogtown, such as the big pyramid and the hotels, where people who are doing very well live. And while that's not necessarily new as a concept to Night City, it is a bit of a microcosm of those things because they're kind of literally right next to each other, where it's a bit spread out in the rest of the city. And things are particularly bad in Dogtown. With that new area, of course, comes new missions, though. In addition to a variety of side quests, we also get new gigs or jobs we can take from fixers, and I wanted to talk about those specifically because all of them are a lot more involved than they were previously. There's only 10, however, each one of them kind of becomes its own proper side quest in the sense that there's a lot of choices to be made. There's a more engaging story attached to each of them, so while a lot of the base game's gigs can usually be like, go here, kill this person and leave, or go steal something and leave, that kind of thing, all the gigs in Dogtown tend to be a little more engaging than that, which is probably down to the fact that it's a more focused experience. So even the side content in Dogtown was a bit more engaging than the base games as well. Though another bit of, I would say, unique content to Phantom Liberty is the car missions. Now, I believe these exist to mostly get you involved in the car combat, or at least the possibility of it, as patch 2.0 added vehicle combat with vehicles that have weapons directly on them, etc. But in Dogtown and other parts of Night City, once you get this started, you can find cars that one of the fixers in town would like you to steal and then bring to them, and then this leads to repeatable missions where you can basically just hijack cars, though the reward for doing this is incredibly lucrative, so it's definitely worth your time. But I wanted to call it out in particular because it does feel like they added that bit of content specifically to get you engaged in car combat because it comes up a lot there. Now, in engaging with all of those activities, all those new ways to play and enjoy the setting, we're naturally going to be leveling up a bit, and this brings new possibilities. The Phantom Liberty DLC raises the level cap up to 60 from 50, which means we get 10 more ability points, as well as perk points, which means we can increase and diversify our build a little bit, and they even added a new upgrade tier with the DLC for your gear in particular, so things like your iconics and your cyberware can be upgraded further as well. Now, the big new progression system for the DLC, though, is the Relic Tree. Songbird, being a netrunner, manages to access a part of the biochip that is slowly killing us and joins us with Johnny, that allows us to pick up some upgrades from old Militech terminals. Basically, throughout Dogtown, we can find points where we can hook up to old terminals that will provide combat data to us to enhance our proficiencies. This skill tree is relatively basic, but it offers a few ways to refine your playstyle a little bit via some incredibly impactful abilities to things like your cyberware, such as your gorilla arms, mantis blades, monowire, etc. You can upgrade all of those abilities and make them better. There's one that makes you better at sneaking, and another one that will highlight enemy weak points, which you can then break for bonuses. These aren't exactly earth-shattering, but they are very impactful pretty much immediately, and can get you some nice solid bonuses to mix up exactly how you're approaching things. Combined with most of the combat updates that came in Update 2.0, I think they really kind of nailed a fun sweet spot here. But do keep in mind this progression is relatively limited. It's not a huge DLC by any means, but it can provide some pretty nice buffs. To pull all of that together and draw this particular video to a bit of a close, everything I've just mentioned isn't even all of it. There are more rewards to find, new unique weapons, new cars, new rewards in general that you would expect, but I think I've said more than enough to give you a good idea of what this DLC is all about, and it's an interesting one to draw a conclusion on, because realistically, I would say what makes this DLC work is twofold, and only part of it is the DLC. The Update 2.0 that dropped with the DLC that made significant overhauls to the game that frankly made it a much better experience really works in tandem with the great storytelling of the DLC to give you a unique experience that I think actually lives up to what the game was originally trying to do. So in that regard, yes, the DLC is absolutely worth $30. It's a great way to end what was a very interesting tale for Cyberpunk, where they got to go out on a high note. But I wouldn't say it's perfect either. For starters, the area of Dogtown is really small. The beginning of the DLC is, again, very railroady, and much of the side content is just more slightly refined versions of content you would find in the rest of the games, such as gigs, side quests, etc. But Phantom Liberty, in combination with its free Update 2.0, I think did a really great job of turning this game into a fantastic open-world action adventure. I wouldn't say this game is the big hardcore choice and consequence oriented RPG that it was often marketed as, but I do think these updates turned it around and made for a great game. So again, the DLC is very much so worth it, and in a day or two I'll give you my full re-review for the entire game, where I'll talk a little more in-depth about the other systems at play and some of the changes. But that's going to do it for today. I certainly hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.